Muted.
My name is Mike Bottorff. I'm Director of Technology with Nineveh Hensley Jackson United School Corporation. This is our pre-proposal conference conducted by a webinar for our recently released RFP for Internet Service Provision. And this is occurring at approximately 10 o'clock on March 2nd, 2016. Before I get started, what I'd like to request is for those of you participating via the web, if you would type in the chat box to confirm that you can both hear my audio clearly and that you can see the cover slide on your screen, which says NHJ RFP for Internet Service Provision. If you could type that in the chat box and let us know and confirm your participation, that would be helpful. And that way we make sure that everyone is hearing and seeing what they should be before we continue moving forward. And I'll wait just a moment for folks to respond. Okay, it looks like we're clear and everyone's able to hear me and also see the slide deck. So we'll go ahead and move through the presentation and then also take a look at the RFP documents. So a quick agenda, welcome and introductions. Since we're conducting this via webinar, I won't go around the table and have folks introduce themselves. I have documented the attendance of folks in the GoToMeeting screen in the chat window, and that will suffice. And then that's for me. Again, I'm Mike Bottorff, Director of Technology here, and thank you all for participating or attending the pre-proposal conference. For the rest of the agenda, the bulk of our time today will be taken up by walking through the documents of the RFP. That's really the purpose of this webinar, is to just present the documents to vendors and hit some of the highlights and key points that vendors will want to be aware of as they're completing their proposal response. After that, I'll recap the evaluation criteria and our process and talk about our next steps and timelines, and then we should have some time at the end for vendor questions. Also, for reference purposes, this is an E-rate eligible procurement, so we filed the appropriate documentation with USAC to qualify for reimbursement for internet service. Okay, so the next slide here, this just shows a partial image of our RFP cover page. That should say RFP instead of RFQ, but it shows the cover page. And so what I'll do now is I will switch over and open up each individual document in turn and walk through them. So just for reference, that our technology web page, which is www.indiancreekschools.com/technology, contains all this documentation. When you open the page, you'll see the header Technology Department. You'll scroll down to Procurement 2017, and the Internet Service Provision is the first set of documents there. So we'll just go through each of the documents in turn. These are all in PDF or Word or Excel format, and you have the ability to download your own copy, particularly for the forms that you'll be completing as part of your submission. But for the purposes of this webinar, I'll just be opening these up in a web browser just so that we can view them. So the bulk of the RFP document is contained in what's called Part 1, Enclosures and Exhibits. And so this is what we're looking at now. The top page is the cover letter, just stating that we're looking for internet service provision and encouraging qualified vendors to respond. The second page is more of a cover page for the RFP document itself, provides a quick overview of key elements. So at the top here, we're requesting a proposal one original and one electronic. So essentially that just means you need to ship us one physical copy of your proposal and then one electronic copy. The electronic copy can be delivered to me via email, or it can be included with the physical copy of the proposal in the form of a flash drive or some other digital media. We try to do that just to be cost conscious and environmentally conscious, and really we only need one physical copy for records keeping, and the rest is distributed electronically. So the issue date of this RFP was February 13th, 2017. The bid opening, and that effectively just means the time in which we have the bids in hand delivered to us, is March 13th, 2017 at noon, so 12 p.m. local time. And we anticipate award and contract execution within a month of receiving the proposals. We hope to actually do that more quickly, but we're giving ourselves a little bit of a cushion there to read through the proposals and score and evaluate them. Requested service, this is a very straightforward request. We're just looking for internet service, internet connectivity in the form of one or two circuits. We currently have two circuits, and we have not yet determined whether we're going to maintain the two-circuit architecture or whether we'll consolidate to a single circuit, and I'll discuss that more as we go through the proposal documents. The enclosures here, this is essentially an outline of this particular document. There's four main sections in the Part 1, enclosures and exhibits. So you've got the headings here, and it also provides a quick list of the response documents. So this is a reference point for vendors to make sure that they've included all of these elements in their proposal. The last part here, questions. Vendors may submit written questions concerning the solicitation up to 14 days prior to the scheduled response date. So that was a couple days ago. So if you should have already submitted any written questions about the RFP and the proposal process to me. I did receive some of those. I will be posting answers to those written questions later today onto the website that we just reviewed a few moments ago. If you did not get a written question submitted, you will have a chance to answer some questions today during the pre-proposal conference, and in that case, I will also document those questions and post the answers to those as well. Lastly here, the official site for all RFP documents. The URL is there. This link listed here, it does work, but it also works if you just type in indiancreekschools.com/technology. Both of those URLs should take you to the same place. Okay, moving into the bulk of the proposal, Section 1, Purpose and Background. As I mentioned, our purpose here is really to get internet service. Our existing contracts for internet service expire on June 30th at the end of the E-rate contract year, and so we are looking to bid or get our proposals for internet service going forward. And as you'll see later, we don't have a set number of years for the agreement, so we're looking at a variety of options. And I apologize for the typo here. That should say request for proposals there in Section 1.1. In addition, the Section 1.1 identifies that it's an E-rate filing, and it provides the specific 470 application number. So there's the standard processes and documents and steps that we have to complete when applying for E-rate funds, I know both on our side and the vendor side. So this section alludes to that. In terms of material content, though, and what we're interested in, I would refer you to focus on the RFP documents and less on the technical requirements of USAC. Okay, moving on to Section 1.2. So brief background on our district. We're a rural public school district, not far from Indianapolis, Indiana. We are still technically considered part of the Indianapolis metropolitan area, although our district itself is fairly rural and sparsely populated. We're in South Johnson County. The most relevant element in terms of internet service for us is that we are a one-to-one computing environment, so all of our students have devices. We were grades 3 through 12 last year, and this year we rolled out grades K through 2. Grades K through 2 have an iPad, grades 6 through 12 also have an iPad, and grades 3 through 5 have Chromebooks. This coming fall, in 2017, we will be refreshing the grades 6 through 12 devices, and it looks likely that they will be Chromebooks, although that decision has not been finalized yet. In any case, we'll have brand new devices, grades 6 through 12, and we will also have brand new network equipment. Our existing network equipment on site is beyond end of life. In summary, in terms of internet service, we anticipate at a minimum a modest increase in our overall bandwidth use as our network transmits network traffic more effectively, and that our students and teachers utilize the devices more frequently than they've done in past years. And I'll speak a little bit about our current environment in Section 2. So Section 1.3, as I mentioned, our objective is to obtain internet service, a long-term agreement for internet service. Currently, we have 2 separate internet connections, and we will use this proposal process and the responses we receive from vendors to determine whether we want to maintain 2 separate connections or consolidate into a single connection. Section 1.4, just a review of the timeline and important dates. As I mentioned, the RFP was issued on February 13th. Deadline for written questions was February 28th, 2 days ago. Our pre-proposal conference is occurring now, and the proposal response deadline is March 13th at noon. I believe that is a Monday, so you'll want to make sure that you get the physical copy of your response shipped out on Friday or Saturday, depending on your delivery or your shipping method. That way that we receive it in the morning prior to the bid opening. We anticipate beginning our review of the proposals that very afternoon, so we expect to stick to that timeline. In terms of vendor selection and contract award, we did list April 13th as being the drop dead date earlier here, but we hope to actually move through that process by the end of March and be ready to move forward by then. And the rest of the section just refers to the written questions, the pre-proposal conference, and the posting of written questions. I actually just looked at our responses to written questions, and as I mentioned earlier, if there are questions during this conference, I will add those to the vendor written questions document, and I have not yet posted that, but it will be posted later this afternoon to the website. Section 2, scope of procurement. So this really addresses more of the technical specifications of the business arrangements for the internet service. So Section 2.1, length of contract. Typically, we look at 3-year agreements. That's more of a standard that a lot of school districts like and a lot of vendors like. So we probably will look at 3-year agreements. However, if we get a proposal from a qualified vendor that we're pleased with, and it ranges up to 5 years, we'll consider a 5-year contract, particularly if the pricing on a 4 or a 5-year contract is significantly better. So if it's much more advantageous for us to go with a 4 or 5-year contract than a 2 or 3-year contract, we will do so. We would prefer not to do a 1-year contract, because then we get to do, we have to bid it out again as that contract expires in accordance with the E-rate requirements. It's a lot of extra work on our side. However, we will look at a 1-year option if the proposals and pricing that we receive is not as good as we had hoped for. We may pursue a 1-year agreement and then look to bid it again next year. It is our hope as a district that that does not happen, we would prefer for a much lengthier contract. So I hope that vendors are able to provide a positive response in that respect. Section 2.2 just identifies our location. So Indian Creek, we're Indian Creek schools. All of our schools are named Indian Creek. Our formal district name is Nineveh Hensley Jackson United School Corporation. Both of our internet circuits currently terminate at the Indian Creek Middle School officially, although the Indian Creek Middle School and Indian Creek High School are connected buildings. So that is the official address, 801 West Indian Creek Drive, where the circuits terminate. The other interesting thing is, even though we have two distinct internet circuits, they do currently terminate in the same building into the same data center. So we do not have significant geographic redundancy despite having two circuits. So we do have logical redundancy and obviously redundancy with two separate vendors. And those circuits, once they leave our building, do travel on different paths out, but geographically, if the building was damaged or the lines were damaged, out on the street, it could easily disrupt both internet circuits. That is the reason why we are considering potentially consolidating, despite the advantages of two circuits, simply because we do not really get the geographic protection of a second backup circuit the way they're physically connected today. Even if we installed a circuit at one of our other buildings, we are all largely on the same campus. So the elementary and intermediate school is next door to the middle school and high school, and the administration is on the building is on the other side. So we may, and I guess the summary of what I'm trying to convey to vendors is this is why we have not decided whether to maintain two circuits or consolidate into one at this time, simply because even moving the second circuit to one of our different buildings does not really provide us significant geographic redundancy over what we have currently. So we will consider that those options as we evaluate the proposals. Section 2.3 here, the way our two circuits are currently set up is one is a primary, one is a secondary. We anticipate keeping a similar structure where our primary circuit is utilized for the bulk of the traffic and the secondary circuit is utilized for less and is used as additional bandwidth as needed, I guess would be the best way to describe it. Typically, we route our internal network to specifically one or one of these or the other, and it provides traffic for different schools. But once again, I'll summarize that. The reason for my providing that information is to explain why we've asked for the type of bids that we are asking for. So in that table under section 2.3, you'll see circuit 1 is the larger circuit, and we're currently, that circuit is 200 megabits per second. So we certainly want to go up to 300 at a minimum, but we're interested in considering proposals all the way up to 1 gigabit per second, knowing that the internet traffic will increase over time as students use more multimedia and as our teachers utilize the one-to-one devices more consistently in the curriculum. Circuit 2, there is the smaller circuit, the secondary circuit that serves a smaller portion of the district, and it is currently 100 megabits per second, and we are not entirely certain that we need to increase that. So hence, we will be accepting bids for 100 megabits per second, but I wanted to leave the door open to move that up to a very high number as well. So we're open to the idea of moving that up to 1 gigabit per second as well, really just to see what kind of pricing is available in the marketplace. We're confident that we will be increasing circuit 1 significantly, and we may also decide to increase the circuit 2 as well. to provide our students and staff with the best possible internet experience for the money available. Moving on to Section 3. This portion of the RFP describes the evaluation criteria and vendor selection. We've not been too overly complex with this, given that we are looking at an internet service, which is fairly straightforward. So our standard approach to evaluation criteria is a two-phase process. And what that really means is the first phase is minimum requirements. We call that administrative screening. And essentially this means that a proposing vendor is large enough, has a sufficient enough client base and revenue and profitability history and capacity to support our school district, or in effect provide the desired internet service. And so it's really just a hoop that we have vendors go through so that we don't waste vendor time and that we don't waste our time evaluating folks that can't really provide the service. In this case, again, it's really just about size, revenue, and operating history, and providing 3 comparable references. And I'll talk more about that as we reach the other documents. So vendors that move through that administrative screening, which is practically 100% in most cases, then we'll go to evaluating the actual proposal, the response evaluation. There are a few criteria here. Of course, the E-rate requires us to weight cost at least 50% and also have it be the highest evaluation component. So in this case, though, giving this internet service, we've allocated 75% of the weighting to cost. The rest of this bullet here simply describes how we'll calculate the vendor score for their cost. The one element that's slightly different is because we're asking vendors to provide costs at various bandwidths, we will assess which of those options for Circuit 1 and Circuit 2, or Circuit 1 if we decide to only go with a single circuit, which of those bandwidth best meets the district's needs and fits within our available budget. And then once we've decided on that particular bandwidth or circuit combination, then we'll take the pricing for that specific circuit and apply to this formula here that you see on your screen. And I know that's a little bit vague for vendors, not knowing precisely which bandwidth we want to choose, but from our perspective, we need to do the RFP process to understand what kind of pricing is available for various bandwidths before we make that decision. So my recommendation to vendors would be simply to provide the best possible pricing they can at each bandwidth level or each combination of circuits, and go from there. And the same description goes for the number of years of agreement too. As I mentioned earlier, we are interested in a longer agreement, particularly if the pricing is significantly better for a longer term. The next most important criteria for us is vendor qualifications, and so this is even beyond the minimum requirements of providing the service and being large enough to support our district and having experience in the area. So in this category, we look at changes in ownership, client base, terminations. We also are going to look at value-added services. Although these are not required to meet our needs, we do have an interest in features such as proactive monitoring, where we receive alerts from the vendor if something looks suspicious or something looks wrong, or if something was down. We also would be interested in threat mitigation. So if there's traffic that appears to be virus-based or spam-based, to provide alerts, to receive alerts for that, or bursting services, which would allow us to exceed the contracted bandwidth on a temporary basis so that it doesn't diminish our user experience, as long as we don't exceed that amount for very long. So we would appreciate some of those services, and vendors that can provide those services will score better in this particular category. I should also mention two additional backup services too. So server hosting and co-location or off-site data backup are also services that we either currently use or would be interested in implementing down the road. And so even though we are not scoring those in terms of cost on this proposal, we consider that as part of a well-rounded, well-qualified vendor proposing on this work. And in the last portion here also too, we will base some of the score on the vendor references. Certainly we are most interested in similarly sized, similarly situated references, so other school corporations in central Indiana, ideally. And lastly, as we're going through the evaluation criteria, each of these bulleted sections identifies what information we as a district will use to assign the evaluation score. So for this one in particular, as an example, we will use whatever vendors provide in forms 3 through 7 of the vendor response forms to score this criteria. And we will be going over the vendor response forms shortly. Thirdly, we are also interested in the technical architecture of the service being provided. Let me check. Oh, and that's a typo. I apologize. I knew that didn't look right. So I will make that correction in an addendum that's posted later today with the vendor written questions. So just to recap this table, 75% of the scores cost 750 points. 15% is vendor qualifications, 150 points. 50 points, or 5%, is technical architecture, and 50 points is vendor preference. So I was just getting ready to talk about the technical architecture. So that is 50 points, the third criteria. Down here it says 200 points, which is incorrect. That's just an oversight on our part. So to clarify, this should be 50 points. But back to the topic of this criteria, technical architecture, we need vendors to provide a little bit of information about what kind of internet connection they're providing, what's the underlying physical cable, for example. Are you providing passive fiber or active fiber? Is there going to be switching equipment installed on site to support the connection? Is it OC3? So just a little bit of information about how the traffic will get out to your central office and be routed from there. And mainly we're just looking for the technical specifications of a highly reliable and resilient solution, and also some at least narrative description, or ideally an attached map of the geographic route, because if we do decide to retain two separate circuits, we would like to have them be geographically redundant once they leave our premise. So that way, if there's a disaster in one city, our traffic can come through a separate location. Working under the assumption that folks in your engineering and technical team will know how to provide that information in the proposal. And then finally, the last criteria is vendor preference. We include this as a thank you to a lot of our vendors who do excellent work. And we also have a preference for vendors that are local or regional. So primarily we would want a vendor who has a headquarters or a satellite office within 100 miles of our location, which is in Trafalgar, Indiana. For the most part, that includes the entire Indianapolis metro area, but it could include other regions and cities in the southern part of the state as well to get this vendor preference. Now, as you can see, this is only a small portion of the entire score, so it's not to say that a more remote vendor could not win the bid. In addition, we favor vendors, like I said, that we've had a positive experience with in the past. So to get this entire 50 points, you would need to have a headquarters or office nearby and have been a good vendor for us in the past to get the full 50 points. The last two portions here of Section 3 are just standard RFP segments for us. One is competitive negotiation, and that essentially just says that we have the right to follow up with questions, ask clarifications about the bids submitted, and negotiate a formal contract after we've selected the final vendor. Similarly, the best and final offer just gives us the flexibility that if we receive some information we didn't expect, or if we receive pricing we didn't expect, either to the good side or the bad side, that we can go back out to selected vendors and ask for a best and final offer. And that process would include, some questions for clarification or a request for a revised cost proposal or something of that nature. These are extremely useful to us, and I will say they're rarely used, but in the cases where we have a virtual tie between proposing vendors, the best and final is valuable for us to break that tie. And in terms of negotiating a contract, if there are unusual terms and conditions or things we haven't seen before, these two clauses really give us the opportunity to address those. And so when needed, in the very rare circumstances that they're needed, these are very valuable options for us. And the last section of part one here is the proposal format and content, and this just gives a narrative description of the various documents and elements that we expect in the vendor responses. So 4.1 here just reiterates that all of the documents posted associated with the RFP should provide complete and comprehensive information for vendors to submit a proposal. And this includes this pre-proposal conference as well as the forthcoming responses to vendor written questions. And then 4.2 walks through the format of the response. As I mentioned earlier, it's one original and one electronic copy. And it should include these elements. So response cover page. This is really just a signature sheet for whomever at your firm is authorized to submit such a bid. This will also be our formal and official point of contact once the bid is submitted. So any follow-up questions, if there's a best and final process, or selection notice for the winning vendors, will go to that contact person. The vendor response forms, that is where the vendors will submit the bulk of the narrative information about their proposal and what they're offering and the background about the company. We'll walk through those shortly during this conference. Detailed pricing forms, similarly, we'll walk through those shortly. This is the form where vendors will provide all the cost and pricing information. Service invoice order form, this is just your formal invoice process for us to see what the order form looks like. Typically those invoices include the net payment date and some terms and conditions and all that. So this is just a sample an invoice for us to link up with your proposal. And then lastly, 4.2.5 here, we are looking for a longer term agreement, but even if it's just a year, there's typically a set of standard terms and conditions that go with the internet service provision. So we expect vendors to include a copy of their proposed agreement with this proposal. All right, so that is part one. Like I said, the extensive narrative portion of the RFP, which we call part one, enclosures and exhibits. I will move on now to the remaining documents associated with the RFP. So part two is the mailing label. This is really just to help us administratively. So please cut this out, put your company name here, and affix it to the mailing envelope. This allows our administrative staff to set those aside and not get them lost in the shuffle. It ensures that they all get to me at the appropriate date and time. So please cut that out and attach that to your envelope. Proposal cover page, as I mentioned in our earlier discussion, this is really the signature form for you to submit. So whoever your formal contact will be should complete this or at least sign this. It also recaps the different documents and elements that should be included in the proposal up here at the top of this page. It includes a line for your USAC number. Since this is an E-rate procurement process, this is required. All vendors must have already filed and been approved with USAC for E-rate services. And then lastly, over here in this box on the left side is a brief statement about FOIA requests. So as a public agency, we can be subjected to Freedom of Information Act requests from time to time. However, information of a proprietary nature included in a bid or a proposal or solicitation such as this can be withheld. So in more layman's terms, we will not publicly post any information that vendors deem proprietary. But to do that, what vendors will need to do is check this yes box here, letting us know that there is some proprietary information in the proposal and also in the proposal itself or on this form. Either way, vendors should let us know what pages that they are considering proprietary. And in the situation where we get a FOIA request, say from a competing vendor, we have to release that information, but we will be able to withhold the information that's designated as proprietary from the FOIA request. So those are the main elements of this signature page, and we put the FOIA information here on the signature page so that it is visible in front and center with your authorized signing agent from your firm. Okay, part 4, vendor response forms. Hold on just a moment while I switch screens. So the vendor response forms are posted to the website here in Word format so that you can complete the forms as is instead of having to finagle around PDFs or handwrite them. So hold on just a moment, we'll switch to that. Here we go. Okay, so these are the vendor response forms, and as I mentioned earlier, this is for the most part where the bulk of vendor information and response will take place. So we'll walk through this quickly. And the reason that we've put them in this format is so that we can literally just set them next to one another. And when our evaluation teams looks at the proposals, they'll put the same page from each vendor so they can make a direct apples-to-apples comparison among the responses. So the first part is, as I mentioned, phase 1, the administrative requirements. That just means minimum requirements for response. So this is essentially a checklist element. The first part, you just put an X in the box and let us know, are you proposing 1 internet circuit or are you proposing 2? If we decide to consolidate and move to a single circuit, then obviously every vendor will be eligible that proposed at least 1 circuit. If vendors propose 2 circuits, we may still choose 2 separate vendors, or we may choose a single vendor providing 2 circuits. But in any case, this is where vendors will let us know, hey, proposing 1 circuit or 2. And then the second part of this provides a list, again, of the documents and elements required for the proposal response. So I recommend that vendors just use this as their checklist to make sure they didn't leave anything out. So as you complete these forms and compile them with your proposal, just put an X in the box so that you know you've completed it. Form 2 specifically addresses the minimum requirements I referenced earlier. So our baseline here is 3 years of providing the same or similar internet services. So the same technical specifications and the same bandwidth is really what we're talking about here in your first year of business. And then also minimum client base requirements, as I mentioned, 3 K-12 school districts, ideally in central Indiana, but we will consider references from other states as long as they're public K-12 school districts as well. And preferably similarly sized districts, or since we're looking at internet service provision, larger districts will be fine as well, but not so much smaller. The one other minimum requirement, and this is simply associated with the fact that this is an E-rate procurement process, and the E-rate reimbursable year or fiscal year starts on July 1st, ends on June 30th. So we need to have this internet service up and running on July 1st. That would be the first billable date, regardless of when it's actually plugged in. So vendors need to commit to that as part of the minimum requirements as well. Okay, Form 3. This is an executive summary. So this is where we allow vendors to, in free-form narrative, explain why they are the best option for our school district to provide internet service, whatever that may be, the highest speed, most reliable service, best support center, whatever that is. This is your space to provide that unique advantage pitch to us. The only thing to note is that we're limiting to 1 page, so please be concise. We like to move through these processes as quickly as possible. And the next few forms focus on the vendor qualifications, which is the 15% criteria mentioned earlier. And so a lot of this is basic background. What's the name of the company? Is there a parent company? It's important for us to know whether you're a subsidiary or not. Obviously, the USAC SPIN number again, since that's required. Type of business, ownership changes, gross revenue, operating revenue. If you decline to provide the revenue or profit or net income information, please describe why. So that, in some cases, privately held companies don't disclose that information, and that does not necessarily rule vendors out. But we much prefer that it's in there because that tells us the size and scope of your company and how it gives us an indication of how able you are to support our needs as a school district. Many school districts use a lot of bandwidth and have a pretty high demand, and so it's important that the size and scope of the company be able to back that. And then the last few items here, total FTEs. This is also an indicator of how well you're able to support us as a K-12 school corporation in that service. And I'll just move on here. These last questions, again, give us some background on the company. Form 5, this will also be accounted for under the vendor qualifications criteria. This is the service approach, and service approach primarily centers on when we have an issue with our internet service, how is that handled? So number 1 here, where are the staff located? What are their hours? Number 2, how do we contact you as a vendor if we have an internet issue, whether it's a service outage or a bandwidth limit problem? How do we contact you is number 2. Number 3, how do you process and respond to these requests? So this tells us a little bit about the kind of service we'll receive. And then number 4 as well, again, service levels. What is your response time? What is your network uptime? What are your benchmarks for providing internet service, and how successfully have you met them in the past? So that's number 5. So what is your history of meeting your network uptime targets, or your first call response time targets, time to resolution targets, or whatever metrics you have and use, please submit those. Form 6, the solution features. This is what I had mentioned before about the the basic and value-added features that your company offers. So make sure that when you're responding to this section that you indicate what elements are provided with the base cost. So some vendors offer, proactive monitoring alerts or bursting services within the base cost. And then if there are value-added features, we're interested in hearing about those as well. So whether that's 24/7 support, or whether that's virus or spam and threat mitigation, if those are additional costs, we would still like for you to include a narrative about them here in Form 6, but just do not provide formal pricing on the price chart. If we are interested in those services, we'll follow up in more detail to get pricing for that. So, long story short, if there are value-added features associated with your service, we do not want pricing for those as part of this response, but we would like to hear about them here in this narrative. Once again, we ask that you be concise here, so please keep this to one page. However, vendors are welcome to provide PDF attachments such as technical specification sheets or marketing brochures or links to web pages that describe some of these value-added services, and we will review those as well. So Form 7, this is ancillary services, and the way I distinguish these are not services directly related to an internet connection or internet service. So back up here on Form 6, all of these basic and value-added services would be directly related to the internet service. I guess like usage charting and monitoring, that would be internet traffic. DNS resolution, that would be directly related to the internet service. Form 7, ancillary services, that would be related to network or server services or solutions that your company offers. Primarily, our experience with internet vendors is they often offer offsite data backup or server hosting and co-location in their own data centers. But this could include other things that we haven't mentioned here. Just as long as they're not directly related to the internet service, those should be included in here in Form 7. And again, please limit it to one page, but you may include attachments or links to web pages. Okay, Form 8, this is where we discuss the technical specifications. As I mentioned earlier, we are interested in a fast, highly reliable internet connection, and so we do want some background on the technical architecture. So primarily, what is that? So what kind of physical fiber is it? Is it active or passive fiber? What type of fiber is it? OC3 or something different? What's the logical framework for those communications? And then geographically, once it leaves our site, especially if you're proposing two internet circuits, please let us know how those circuits are routed and how they'll go in different directions after they leave our facility. But even if you're only offering one circuit, and we decide to get one circuit from vendor A and another circuit from vendor B, we would still want to see that those geographic paths are different. So please provide that information. A map would be fantastic, but if you can clearly and concisely explain that in narrative form, that will suffice as well. And again, attachments are acceptable. And then lastly, Form 9 is vendor preference. As I mentioned in the criteria, we're interested in favoring vendors with a headquarters or office within the region, and if they're a current NHJ vendor with which we've had a positive relationship. So those are the vendor response forms, and again, this is really the bulk of what you'll be responding to. You'll be putting your marketing material, your narrative information into these forms, and then just simply attaching pre-existing documentation for some of the items to that. All right, I am now going to open up Part 5, the detailed pricing forms. So back here, you can see on our website, here's we're now to Part 5, detailed pricing forms. And that will be an Excel document. And just like the vendor response forms, you will have the ability to complete your response directly in the document and return it to us. Just a moment. Okay, here's Part 5, the detailed pricing. Let me zoom in and make this a little more visible. So this Excel document has 3 tabs. The first page is simply just instructions. Talks a little bit about our forms-based approach, which I mentioned to you. It really helps us do an apples-to-apples comparison among the vendor offerings. It also just includes a reminder that in addition to providing or to completing the pricing forms here that we're looking at, that you also attach a sample service invoice or order form that you typically use to initiate this kind of agreement. And then also, because oftentimes a separate person will be seeing or approving these forms, we'd like to have their contact information here as well. Again, this should be the primary contact for the proposal. Their information should be here. And then this also just provides a place for you to place an X next to Internet Circuit 1, Internet Circuit 2 to let us know which ones you're proposing. So there are 2 worksheets to complete. Tab number 1, one-time costs. This would really only, you really only complete this if there are upfront installation costs. So if there's a certain amount of time or labor that you charge for to get the circuit up and running, that would go here. And all that we've asked is that you break that down by circuit or task. So if you say a certain amount of time to install circuit 1, just as an example, I'll type it in, circuit number 1 install. And circuit number 2 install. So in that case, if you're proposing 2 circuits and you have a certain amount of installation time that's required on an upfront cost, then simply just put the hours here, and then the blended rate here, and all of the cells that are in purple, they will auto-populate. So you really just need to put in the hours and the blended rate. And our only request here is that however you would break the tasks down on an invoice or an order form is you put them down here the same way. It's very possible that vendors may not have any initial upfront costs or any one-time installation costs, or any of that might be broken out over the life of the contract, in which case you may leave this tab completely blank. So if there is no one-time cost or upfront installation or setup fee, then this can be left blank. And then more importantly, here is tab 2, the recurring costs. So because we're interested in considering a few different bandwidth options for our circuits, and because we're interested in looking at a few different length of agreements, this tab is a little more involved than we typically like to do. But the most important thing to remember is that we're looking for annual costs. So if you're proposing a 300 megabit circuit, then you would fill it out across from a 300 megabit circuit in whatever year increments that you're offering. Simply speaking, if you don't offer 1-year agreements, or if you don't offer 4 or 5-year agreements, just leave those blank. We will account for that. So you only need to fill in the cells that would apply to the length of agreement and the pricing for a specific bandwidth that you are offering. And my hope is that that is also described fairly well here in the instructions at the top. Similarly, if you are only offering a single circuit, then you would only need to complete this top table or whatever portion of this top table applies. And you would leave the second table blank. And I hope that that's fairly straightforward. I don't know what more there is to say about it. As I mentioned, once we take a look at the responses and break down the costs within our available budget, and also considering what we increase in terms of, or what we anticipate in terms of increased bandwidth in the future, we'll select a desired bandwidth for Circuit 1 and Circuit 2, and then we'll take the price proposal from each vendor at that bandwidth level and use that for the cost proposal. And similarly for the year too. So we'll choose a bandwidth level, and then we'll choose a desired agreement term and use that pricing. So I know that it can be difficult sometimes, but I would encourage vendors to provide the best possible pricing at all levels that they're willing to propose. And again, unless the pricing and technical specifications that we receive from vendors fall short of our expectations, there would be no detriment to vendors for simply not proposing a one-year agreement, for example. If you as a vendor say, we don't want to do one-year agreements, it's just not in our best interests, that won't provide any detriment to your ability to win this contract unless we receive poor pricing across the board. So I hope that makes sense. So let me close that down and go back to the website here briefly and see if there's anything else to cover. So as you can see on the, let me switch the screen. As you can see here on the website, we've covered parts, requests for proposals, parts 1 through 5. Attachment A is the conference slides that we were looking at the beginning. Attachment B will be a pre-proposal conference recording. It will be posted over here above the other pre-proposal conference recording. And Addendum 1 is the information about the pre-proposal conference, and Addendum 2 is the responses. So as the website suggested, the recording is not available yet. We're not finished with it. The responses to vendor questions are not quite available yet, although those will be out this afternoon. I have already drafted those, and they'll be out shortly. So that is the end of the core part of my presentation. So let's flip back over to the slides. So just to quickly recap our evaluation criteria, as E-rate requires and as is our interest, the cost is the most important. 75% of the evaluation score will be cost. And as I said, we'll select a bandwidth and an agreement term after we receive the proposals and utilize that pricing information to score cost. 15% for vendor qualifications, 5%, 50 points for technical architecture, 5%, 50 points for vendor preference. Last thing, just to recap next steps, we already passed the deadline for written questions. If there are questions that come up today here shortly, I will include those in our formal written response. Today is the pre-proposal conference. The deadline is March 13th at noon, and we hope to select a vendor and award a contract by the end of the month, but no later than April 13th. So with that, thankfully, I will be done talking, at least momentarily, and I will open the floor for questions. And just so that we don't end up with folks talking over one another, if there are any questions from vendors participating in the webinar, if you would please type those into the chat box, and I will provide a few minutes here for folks to consider questions and type them in. What I will do once I receive the question in the chat box is that I will read the question aloud and then provide an answer If I do not have an answer at this time, I will post it as part of the response to vendor questions. So for that, I open up the questions. Do any vendors on the conference currently have any questions to submit? Please type them in the chat box at this time. As I wait for vendor questions to come in, also, if you are comfortable with all the information that's been shared and that's in the documentation, and you do not have any questions, please go ahead and type that in the chat box as well. Let me know that you do not have any questions, and once I hear from everyone that they have no further questions, we'll conclude the pre-proposal conference. Okay, so it looks like there are no questions, so that's good news. So hopefully that means we thoroughly covered all the information necessary either in the documentation provided or in the conference here today. So to conclude, I will thank everyone who joined into the conference today, and I also thank everyone who will watch the recording after the fact, and we appreciate your time and attention to the proposal and look forward to seeing your responses. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day.